The year was 1816, and London's aristocratic society existed within a delicate web of appearances, bloodlines, and carefully guarded secrets. The Georgian mansions that lined Mayfair stood like monuments to generations of noble families, their limestone facades gleaming in the pale English sunlight, while inside, crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors that had witnessed countless scandals, alliances, and broken hearts. Within the grand drawing rooms of these palatial residences, young ladies in empire-waisted gowns of silk and muslin practiced their curtsies with mathematical precision, their every movement choreographed by decades of tradition. The rustling of taffeta petticoats and the gentle clink of pearl necklaces created a symphony of refinement that masked the fierce competition brewing beneath the surface of polite society. The social season of 1816 promised to be particularly eventful, with whispers circulating through the ton about mysterious newcomers, questionable inheritances, and romantic entanglements that threatened to upset the carefully maintained balance of power among England's most influential families. In this world where reputation meant everything and scandal could destroy a family standing for generations, every smile concealed calculation, every compliment harbored judgment, and every friendship balanced on the razor's edge of mutual benefit. Lady Felora Ashworth had appeared in London society like a perfectly cut diamond, brilliant and seemingly flawless, catching the light and drawing every eye in the room. Her beauty was undeniable, cascading auburn curls that caught fire in candlelight, emerald eyes that seemed to hold depths of mystery, and a figure that made even the most conservative gowns appear scandalously elegant. She moved through ballrooms with the grace of a swan gliding across still water, her voice carrying the refined accent of the finest education, her manners impeccable according to every rule of etiquette established by generations of noble breeding. The story of Lady Felora's arrival in London had been as romantic as any novel. She claimed to be the long-lost daughter of the late Earl of Ashworth, discovered living in a cottage in the Scottish Highlands after her mother's death had revealed the truth of her noble heritage. The documentation appeared authentic, the lawyers seemed satisfied, and the substantial inheritance that accompanied her title made any doubt seem churlish. Within months, she had established herself as one of the season's most sought-after young ladies, her dance card filled at every social gathering, her drawing room crowded with suitors bearing flowers and poetry. But beneath the glittering surface of Mayfair's social whirl, Lady Corvella Blackthorne watched with the calculating gaze of a predator studying its prey. Lady Corvella possessed a different kind of beauty, sharp, intelligent, and somehow dangerous. Her dark hair was always arranged in severe perfection, her pale blue eyes missed nothing, and her smile never quite reached those observant eyes. Born into one of England's oldest families, she had been raised from childhood to understand that knowledge was power, and that the carefully maintained facades of high society often concealed the most devastating truths. Lady Corvella had noticed inconsistencies in Lady Felora's story from the beginning. Small details that didn't align, mannerisms that seemed studied rather than natural, moments when the mask of perfect breeding slipped just enough to reveal something else underneath. While other members of society were charmed by Lady Felora's romantic tale of discovery and inheritance, Lady Corvella began her own investigation with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the most beautiful facades often concealed the ugliest deceptions. The investigation led Lady Corvella through dusty archives, conversations with elderly servants who remembered the real Earl of Ashworth, and careful examination of documents that had been accepted too quickly by lawyers eager to close a profitable case. What she discovered would shake the foundations of London society and destroy the carefully constructed life that Lady Felora had built upon lies and stolen identity. As the social season progressed toward its pinnacle, the royal dinner hosted by His Majesty himself, Lady Corvella refined her plans with the precision of a master strategist. The royal dinner represented the absolute peak of social achievement, an event where only the most distinguished members of the aristocracy were invited to dine in the presence of royalty. For Lady Felora, receiving an invitation represented the ultimate validation of her place in society. For Lady Corvella, it represented the perfect stage for a revelation that would echo through the halls of every great house in England. The royal palace preparations began weeks in advance, with teams of servants polishing silver that had graced royal tables for centuries, arranging flowers in patterns that followed court protocol established during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, and preparing a menu that would satisfy the refined palates of England's most distinguished nobles. The dining hall itself was a masterpiece of royal grandeur, with walls adorned by portraits of monarchs past, a ceiling painted with scenes of British triumph, and a table long enough to accommodate the cream of aristocratic society. Lady Felora spent those final weeks in a whirlwind of preparation, commissioning a gown that would establish her as the epitome of fashion and elegance. The dress was a creation of midnight blue silk with silver embroidery that caught the light like captured starlight, with a décolletage that was daring enough to be memorable but conservative enough to meet royal approval. Her jewels were chosen with equal care, sapphires that had supposedly belonged to the Ashworth family for generations, their deep blue perfectly complementing her gown and adding weight to her claimed heritage. The morning of the royal dinner dawned grey and misty, typical London weather that seemed to mirror the undercurrents of tension running through Mayfair's most fashionable households. In her elegant townhouse on Berkeley Square, Lady Felora stood before her pier glass mirror while her ladies' maid arranged the final details of her toilette. The reflection that stared back was perfection itself, every curl arranged to catch candlelight, every detail of her gown adjusted to enhance her figure, every piece of jewelry positioned to maximum advantage. But beneath the composed exterior, anxiety gnawed at Lady Felora like a persistent ache. She had worked too hard and risked too much to allow anything to threaten her position now. The life she had built for herself represented everything she had dreamed of during the long, cold years when she had been nobody special, just another poor girl with more ambition than prospects. The transformation from Margaret Fletcher, seamstress's daughter from Birmingham, to Lady Felora Ashworth, heir to one of England's most respected earldoms, had required years of careful planning, meticulous study, and a kind of daring that bordered on recklessness. Margaret Fletcher had possessed natural beauty and intelligence, but those gifts meant nothing without the proper breeding and connections to access high society. She had educated herself by reading every book she could find about aristocratic manners, memorizing genealogies until she could trace noble bloodlines better than most heralds, and studying the subtle differences in speech and deportment that separated the truly well-born from those who merely aspired to their ranks. When the opportunity arose to assume the identity of the missing Ashworth heiress, she had seized it with the desperation of someone who understood that such chances came only once in a lifetime. The real Lady Felora Ashworth had died in infancy, a fact known only to a few elderly servants who had long since passed away or been pensioned off to remote cottages where their memories posed no threat. The Earl of Ashworth himself had died without direct heirs, leaving his estate to distant relatives who had shown little interest in investigating the sudden appearance of a supposed daughter with impressive documentation and a story romantic enough to satisfy society's love of dramatic revelations. But now, as she prepared for the most important evening of her assumed life, the woman calling herself Lady Felora could not shake the feeling that her carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. There had been subtle signs, conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, glances exchanged between dowagers who remembered the real Earl, questions about her childhood that probed deeper than mere social curiosity. Most troubling of all was the persistent attention of Lady Corvella Blackthorne, whose pale eyes seemed to see through every carefully rehearsed story to the desperate deception underneath. Meanwhile, across the fashionable squares of Mayfair, Lady Corvella was completing her own preparations with the methodical precision of a general preparing for battle. Her gown was a creation of deep burgundy velvet that emphasized her pale skin and dark hair, conservative in cut but undeniably elegant in its sophistication. She had chosen diamonds for her jewelry, clear, brilliant stones that seemed to reflect light with the same piercing intensity as her gaze. Unlike Lady Felora's nervous energy, Lady Corvella projected calm confidence, the assurance of someone who held all the cards and was simply waiting for the perfect moment to play them. Lady Corvella's investigation into Lady Felora's background had been exhaustive and damning. She had discovered records that proved the real Lady Felora's death, testimonies from servants who remembered the Earl's devastation at losing his only child, and most crucially, evidence of Margaret Fletcher's presence in Birmingham during the very years when the supposed Lady Felora claimed to have been living in Scotland. The documentation supporting Lady Felora's inheritance had been masterfully forged, but not quite perfectly enough to fool someone with Lady Corvella's resources and determination. The question that remained was not whether Lady Felora was an impostor, but how to reveal that truth in a manner that would achieve maximum impact while protecting Lady Corvella's own reputation as the exposer of such a scandal. The royal dinner presented the perfect opportunity, a gathering of the most influential members of society, an occasion formal enough that revelations made there would carry extraordinary weight, and in setting grand enough to ensure that the story would be told and retold throughout London's drawing rooms for years to come. As afternoon shadows lengthened across London's rooftops, carriages began converging on the royal palace, their wheels clattering against cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of royal processions. Each arrival was announced with ceremony appropriate to the rank of its occupants, creating a parade of England's most distinguished families dressed in their finest evening wear. Duchesses emerged from gilt carriages wearing family diamonds that had adorned royal favorites, marquises stepped down in evening dress that represented the height of masculine elegance, and countesses swept through palace doors trailing perfume and whispered speculation about the evening's guest list. Lady Felora's arrival commanded attention, as she had carefully planned. Her carriage was elegant but not ostentatious, her bearing confident but not presumptuous, her beauty radiant enough to draw admiring glances without appearing to court them deliberately. She moved through the receiving line with practiced grace, her curtsy to His Majesty executed with perfect precision, her responses to royal inquiries appropriately brief and deferential. Every gesture reinforced her position as a legitimate member of the highest ranks of society, someone whose presence at such an exclusive gathering was entirely natural and proper. Lady Corvella's arrival came later, deliberately timed to observe Lady Felora's interactions with other guests. She watched as her target charmed elderly dowagers with tales of her Scottish childhood, as she accepted compliments on her gown with becoming modesty, as she positioned herself strategically among the most influential members of the gathering. It was a masterful performance, Lady Corvella admitted privately, but it was still a performance, and performances could be interrupted by inconvenient truths. The palace dining room had been transformed into a showcase of royal magnificence. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off gold plate and precious stones until the entire room seemed to shimmer with otherworldly brilliance. The table settings represented centuries of royal collecting, each piece of china told a story of diplomatic gifts or artistic patronage, every crystal goblet caught and scattered light like captured rainbows, and the silverware bore the weight of history in its elaborate engravings and royal crests. As the distinguished guests took their places at the royal table according to strict protocols of precedence, the very air seemed to vibrate with anticipation and barely suppressed social energy. The seating arrangement itself told a story of power and influence, with each position carefully calculated to reflect rank, favor, and the delicate balance of personalities that could make the difference between a triumphant evening and a social disaster of legendary proportions. Lady Felora found herself seated between the aging Duke of Warrington, whose conversation centered on his prize-hunting hounds and his extensive collection of medieval armor, and the surprisingly charming Lord Edmund Blackwood, whose recent return from diplomatic service in Vienna had made him one of the season's most intriguing bachelors. Lord Edmund possessed the kind of understated elegance that came from genuine breeding rather than studied imitation, his movements were naturally graceful, his conversation effortlessly witty, and his attention to Lady Felora both flattering and apparently sincere. Lord Edmund Blackwood represented everything that Lady Felora had dreamed of attaining through her carefully constructed deception. At 32, he had achieved distinction in both diplomatic and military service, his family's estates in Yorkshire were among the most beautiful and profitable in England, and his position in society was unassailable. More importantly, his character appeared to match his advantages, he spoke with genuine warmth about his work helping negotiate peace treaties, he showed real interest in Lady Felora's supposed experiences in Scotland, and his compliments had the ring of sincerity rather than mere gallantry. The conversation between Lady Felora and Lord Edmund began with the standard topics deemed appropriate for royal dining, observations about the magnificence of the palace decorations, polite inquiries about mutual acquaintances, and gentle commentary on the previous week's social events. But gradually, as courses appeared and wine loosened tongues just enough to allow for more personal discourse, their exchange deepened into something approaching genuine connection. Lord Edmund spoke of his travels through the Scottish Highlands during a diplomatic mission, describing landscapes of breathtaking beauty and people whose fierce independence had impressed him deeply. Lady Felora responded with carefully prepared stories of her supposed childhood in that same region, drawing on every book she had read and every traveler's tale she had absorbed to create a fictional past that would resonate with his genuine experiences. Her performance was flawless, enriched by details about Highland customs, weather patterns, and local dialects that she had memorized with the dedication of a scholar preparing for the most important examination of her life. What Lady Felora had not anticipated was how Lord Edmund's obvious admiration would affect her own emotions. She had prepared herself to charm him, to use her beauty and wit to secure his interest as another step in establishing her position in society. But his genuine warmth, his evident intelligence, and his surprisingly progressive views on subjects ranging from women's education to social reform awakened feelings that she had not expected to experience. For the first time since beginning her masquerade, she found herself wishing that her responses could be entirely truthful, that her connection with this remarkable man could be built on something more solid than elaborately constructed lies. Meanwhile, Lady Corvella observed these developing romantic currents with the calculating gaze of someone whose own heart had long been subordinated to the pursuit of social advantage. She had been placed strategically across the table from Lady Felora, close enough to overhear conversations while maintaining the appearance of being absorbed in discourse with her own dinner companions. Lady Corvella's companions included the sharp-tongued Countess of Pemberton, whose knowledge of society gossip was encyclopedic, and the scholarly Lord Thornfield, whose passion for genealogical research had proven invaluable to Lady Corvella's investigation. Lady Corvella's own romantic history had been shaped by the harsh realities of aristocratic marriage negotiations. At 26, she had rejected 3 advantageous proposals, not from any romantic notions about love conquering social expectations, but because each potential husband had represented compromises that would have diminished rather than enhanced her position in society. She had watched too many intelligent women lose their independence and influence through marriages that reduced them to ornamental appendages of their husbands' ambitions. The irony was not lost on Lady Corvella that Lord Edmund Blackwood had been among those rejected suitors, though his proposal had come closest to acceptance. Their brief courtship 2 seasons earlier had revealed a meeting of minds that might have developed into genuine affection, but Lady Corvella's discovery of certain irregularities in the Blackwood family finances had led her to withdraw before any formal announcement could be made. The financial concerns had since been resolved through Lord Edmund's diplomatic success, but the opportunity for romance between them had passed into the realm of might-have-beens. Now, watching Lord Edmund's growing fascination with the beautiful impostor across the table, Lady Corvella felt a complex mixture of emotions that she refused to acknowledge as jealousy. Her primary focus remained the satisfaction of exposing Lady Felora's deception and protecting society from such elaborate fraud, but she could not deny a personal interest in preventing Lord Edmund from being deceived by a woman whose entire identity was built on lies. The dinner progressed through multiple courses, each one a masterpiece of culinary artistry that reflected the sophistication of royal entertaining. Servants moved with choreographed precision, removing plates and refreshing wine glasses without interrupting the flow of conversation, their livery resplendent in royal colors and their discretion absolute. The menu itself told a story of British culinary excellence: clear turtle soup garnished with herbs from the royal gardens, salmon from Scottish rivers served with delicate sauces, beef from the finest English herds prepared according to French techniques, and elaborate confections that were themselves works of art. As the evening progressed, the formal structure of royal dining began to relax slightly, allowing for more animated conversation and the kind of social interaction that made such gatherings legendary. Lady Felora found herself the center of an admiring circle that included several of the season's most eligible bachelors, all drawn by her beauty and the romantic mystery of her background. But it was Lord Edmund's attention that she valued most, and she could see in his eyes a growing regard that went beyond mere social appreciation. Lord Edmund had begun to speak of his Yorkshire estates with the enthusiasm of someone hoping to share future plans rather than merely making conversation. He described the ancient castle that had been modernized with every comfort while maintaining its historical character, the extensive libraries filled with rare books and family documents, and the rolling countryside that offered some of England's finest hunting and most beautiful landscapes. His descriptions painted pictures of a life that represented everything Lady Felora had dreamed of achieving: security, beauty, social position, and the companionship of an intelligent and accomplished man. But even as Lady Felora allowed herself to imagine a future as Lady Edmund Blackwood, mistress of Yorkshire estates and mother to children who would inherit both beauty and noble blood, she remained acutely aware of the precarious foundation upon which all such dreams rested. Every smile she shared with Lord Edmund, every moment of apparent connection, depended entirely on maintaining a deception that grew more complex and dangerous with each passing hour. The weight of her masquerade seemed particularly heavy during those moments when Lord Edmund's conversation touched on subjects that required her to elaborate her fictional past. When he mentioned specific Highland clans or historical events, she had to draw on her carefully memorized knowledge while appearing to speak from personal experience. When he asked about family traditions or childhood memories, she had to create believable details while ensuring they aligned with the carefully constructed timeline of her supposed life. The royal dining room had reached that magical hour when excellent wine, superb cuisine, and sparkling conversation combined to create an atmosphere of perfect social harmony. His Majesty himself appeared to be enjoying the evening immensely, engaging various guests in discourse that ranged from politics to poetry, from agricultural innovations to artistic patronage. The soft glow of hundreds of candles created an intimate warmth despite the grandeur of the setting, and the gentle murmur of refined conversation provided a sophisticated soundtrack to what would soon become one of the most memorable dinner parties in London society's recent history. Lady Felora had never felt more confident in her assumed role than she did during those precious moments before her world collapsed entirely. Lord Edmund's attention had become increasingly focused and personal, his conversation peppered with references to future meetings and shared interests that suggested serious romantic intentions. Other guests had begun to regard her with the kind of respectful deference reserved for someone whose social position was not merely accepted but celebrated. Even the sharp-eyed dowagers who normally subjected newcomers to merciless scrutiny seemed charmed by her combination of beauty, breeding, and mysterious romantic background. The conversation had turned to family histories and noble bloodlines, a topic that always fascinated aristocratic gatherings where genealogy served as both entertainment and social currency. The elderly Duchess of Marlborough, whose knowledge of family connections was legendary, had begun recounting amusing anecdotes about various ancestors and their romantic scandals, drawing laughter and encouraging others to share similar stories from their own family histories. Lady Felora participated in this exchange with what appeared to be natural ease, sharing carefully prepared tales about the Ashworth family's Highland connections and their historical role in various Scottish affairs. Her stories were well-researched and plausible, enhanced by details that demonstrated impressive knowledge of Scottish history and culture. Several guests commented approvingly on her obvious pride in her heritage and her charming accent that still carried hints of her supposed Highland upbringing. It was during this moment of triumph, when Lady Felora felt most secure in her position and most hopeful about her romantic prospects with Lord Edmund, that Lady Corvella chose to make her move with the devastating precision of a master strategist who had waited for the perfect moment to strike. Lady Corvella had been observing the evening's dynamics with the patience of someone who understood that timing could mean the difference between an effective revelation and a social disaster that might reflect poorly on the revealer as well as the revealed. She had watched Lady Felora's growing confidence, Lord Edmund's increasing fascination, and the general acceptance that the beautiful impostor had achieved among the gathered nobility. The moment was perfect because the contrast between Lady Felora's apparent triumph and the devastating truth would create maximum impact. Rising gracefully from her seat, Lady Corvella requested permission to address the gathering, a request that was granted with the kind of indulgent attention typically accorded to someone of her impeccable social standing. Her voice, when she spoke, carried clearly through the dining room, pitched to command attention without appearing to strain for effect. "Your Majesty, distinguished guests," Lady Corvella began, her tone conversational yet somehow charged with anticipation, "this evening's delightful conversation about family histories has reminded me of a most curious coincidence that I believe will interest everyone present, particularly those who have been charmed by Lady Felora's romantic tale of discovery and inheritance." The room fell silent with the sudden completeness that occurs when every person present senses that something significant is about to happen. Lady Felora felt her heart begin to race, though she maintained her composed expression through sheer force of will. Lord Edmund glanced between the two women with growing puzzlement, sensing undercurrents that he did not yet understand. His Majesty himself leaned forward slightly, his expression indicating the kind of polite curiosity appropriate to a monarch who was accustomed to being entertained by the intrigues of his subjects. Lady Corvella continued with the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed her words for maximum effect. "Recently, while researching genealogical records for a family history I am compiling, I had occasion to examine the parish records from the Earl of Ashworth's estate in considerable detail. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the infant Lady Felora Ashworth, daughter of the late Earl, was buried in the family chapel in the year 1794, having lived only 3 months after her birth. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that the soft crackling of candle flames became audible throughout the vast dining room. Lady Felora's face remained perfectly composed, but those seated closest to her could see the subtle tension that appeared around her eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of her hands where they rested on the table. Furthermore, Lady Corvella continued, her voice carrying the relentless precision of a prosecutor presenting irrefutable evidence, my research revealed the existence of one Margaret Fletcher, daughter of a seamstress in Birmingham, whose physical description matches our supposed Lady Felora quite remarkably, and who disappeared from Birmingham at precisely the time when the current Lady Felora made her miraculous appearance in London society. Lord Edmund's face reflected the shock and confusion of someone whose entire understanding of reality was being systematically dismantled. His gaze moved from Lady Corvella to Lady Felora, searching for some sign that would indicate whether these accusations represented malicious gossip or devastating truth. The woman he had been falling in love with sat frozen in her chair, her beauty now somehow different, as if Lady Corvella's words had stripped away a glamour that had previously obscured his vision. Lady Corvella reached into her reticule and withdrew a small collection of documents, handling them with the reverence appropriate to evidence that would destroy one life while validating another's suspicions. I have here copies of the burial record for the infant Lady Felora, testimonies from servants who attended the real Lady Felora's brief life and mourned her passing, and most significantly, a detailed account from the Birmingham Constabulary regarding the disappearance of one Margaret Fletcher, whose last known employment was with a dressmaker who specialized in creating gowns for theatrical productions. The theatrical detail struck like a final blow, suggesting not only deception but deception that had been planned and executed with professional skill. Several guests gasped audibly, while others leaned forward in their chairs as if physical proximity could help them better understand the magnitude of what was being revealed. His Majesty's expression had shifted from polite curiosity to grave concern, as befitted a monarch who had just learned that his royal hospitality had been extended to someone under fundamentally false pretenses. Lady Felora, or Margaret Fletcher, as her true identity now stood exposed, finally spoke, her voice carrying a dignity that seemed almost miraculous under the circumstances. Lady Corvella's research appears to be quite thorough, she said quietly, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. I wonder what satisfaction she derives from destroying something beautiful for the sake of proving herself cleverer than everyone else in this room. The response was masterful in its refusal to deny the accusations while simultaneously challenging the motives behind their revelation. It acknowledged Lady Corvella's triumph while suggesting that such triumph came at the cost of destroying something that had brought joy and beauty to many people's lives. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly uncertain whether they were witnessing justice being served or cruelty being disguised as moral duty. Lord Edmund's voice, when he finally found it, carried the strain of someone whose heart was breaking even as his mind struggled to process the implications of what he had learned. "Is it true?" he asked simply, his gaze fixed on the woman he had believed to be Lady Felora with an intensity that seemed to demand honesty as the only possible response to such pain. The silence that followed Lord Edmund's question stretched across the royal dining room like a physical presence, heavy with the weight of consequences that would ripple through London society for years to come. Every person present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed, analyzed, and remembered as long as any of them lived. The beautiful woman who had charmed them all as Lady Felora now sat exposed as Margaret Fletcher, her elaborate deception laid bare before the most important gathering of the social season. Margaret Fletcher, for that was indeed her true name, looked directly at Lord Edmund with eyes that held a mixture of defiance, sadness, and something that might have been relief. The burden of maintaining such an elaborate lie had been immense, requiring constant vigilance and perfect performance in every social interaction. Now that the truth stood revealed, there was a strange freedom in no longer having to maintain the exhausting charade that had consumed every moment of her life for the past 2 years. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying across the hushed dining room with crystal clarity. Lady Corvella's accusations are correct. I am not Lady Felora Ashworth. The real Lady Felora died as an infant, as Lady Corvella has so thoroughly documented. I am Margaret Fletcher, and everything you have come to know about me has been built upon a foundation of carefully constructed lies. The admission sent another wave of shock through the assembled guests, many of whom had become genuinely fond of the woman they had known as Lady Felora. Her confession possessed a dignity that seemed somehow to transcend the criminality of her deception, presenting her not as a common fraud but as someone whose desperation had driven her to extraordinary measures in pursuit of a better life. His Majesty, displaying the kind of composed authority that had made him an effective monarch, rose from his seat with a grace that commanded immediate attention. This revelation, while shocking, requires careful consideration of appropriate consequences, he said, his voice carrying the weight of royal judgment. Deception practiced within our court is a serious matter, but the manner of this lady's conduct since assuming her false identity suggests character that merits consideration alongside her acknowledged crimes. The royal response reflected the complex nature of Margaret's situation. While her deception was undeniably criminal, her behavior as Lady Felora had been exemplary by every standard of aristocratic conduct. She had committed no further crimes, had treated servants and social inferiors with genuine kindness, and had contributed positively to numerous charitable causes favored by London society. The question of justice was complicated by the recognition that her assumed identity had allowed her to become, in many ways, exactly the kind of person that noble birth was supposed to produce. Lady Corvella, having achieved her goal of exposing the deception, now found herself in the unexpected position of watching the consequences of her revelation unfold in ways she had not entirely anticipated. She had expected Margaret Fletcher's exposure to result in immediate arrest, social exile, and complete vindication of her own detective work. Instead, the room seemed divided between those who viewed the revelation as necessary justice and those who were beginning to question whether such complete destruction of a human life was truly warranted by the crimes committed. Lord Edmund stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate as he struggled to reconcile his growing feelings for Lady Felora with the knowledge that Lady Felora had never actually existed. The woman before him was undeniably the same person who had charmed him throughout the evening, whose conversation had revealed intelligence and sensitivity that had nothing to do with noble bloodlines or inherited titles. Yet everything he thought he knew about her background, her family, her very identity, had been proven false. Margaret Fletcher, he said, testing the unfamiliar name as if trying to understand how it related to the woman he had been falling in love with. Tell me this, was anything about our conversation tonight genuine? Did any part of the person I was coming to know actually exist, or was every word another element of your performance? Margaret looked at him with eyes that glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady as she replied. Every word I spoke to you about books, about music, about the beauty of nature and the importance of kindness, all of that was genuine. My feelings, my responses to your conversation, my growing admiration for your character, none of that was performance. Only my name and my supposed history were false. The woman you were coming to know exists, my lord. She simply was not born Lady Felora Ashworth. This distinction, between false identity and false character, seemed to resonate with several guests who had come to genuinely like and respect the woman they had known as Lady Felora. The Duchess of Marlborough, whose sharp tongue had demolished many pretenders to social position, surprised everyone by speaking in Margaret's defense. I have observed this young woman's conduct throughout the season, the Duchess declared, her authoritative voice cutting through the murmur of conversation that had begun to ripple through the room. While her identity may be false, her character has been consistently admirable. She has shown kindness to servants, generosity to those less fortunate, and genuine interest in matters of substance rather than mere social advancement. These qualities do not spring from noble blood but from noble spirit. The Duchess's intervention represented a significant development, as her opinion carried enormous weight throughout London society. If someone of her stature was willing to speak in Margaret's defense, it suggested that the situation was more complex than a simple case of fraud deserving immediate punishment. Lady Corvella watched these developments with growing concern, realizing that her carefully planned exposure was not producing the clear-cut vindication she had expected. Instead of being universally praised for protecting society from deception, she found herself viewed by some as unnecessarily cruel in her methods and timing. The sympathy that Margaret was receiving threatened to transform Lady Corvella from heroic truth-teller to vindictive destroyer of something beautiful. "The question before us," announced the scholarly Lord Thornfield, whose knowledge of legal precedents was extensive, "is whether society is better served by punishing deception regardless of its consequences, or by considering the character revealed through the deceiver's actions. Miss Fletcher has committed fraud, certainly, but she has used that fraud to become exactly the kind of person we claim to value in our social circles." This observation sparked intense discussion among the guests, with various perspectives being expressed about justice, forgiveness, and the nature of noble character. Some argued that birth and breeding were fundamental to social order and that allowing deception to go unpunished would encourage others to attempt similar frauds. Others suggested that Margaret's conduct as Lady Felora had proven that noble character could exist independent of noble bloodlines. Margaret herself listened to these debates about her fate with a composure that impressed even those who remained convinced that she should face severe consequences for her deception. She had gambled everything on her ability to transform herself into someone worthy of the position she had claimed, and while her deception had been exposed, her transformation appeared to have been genuine and complete. The royal dinner, which had begun as a celebration of aristocratic society at its most refined, had evolved into something approaching a philosophical symposium on the nature of identity, character, and justice. The very foundations of social hierarchy were being questioned as guests grappled with the implications of Margaret Fletcher's successful transformation into Lady Felora Ashworth. Lord Edmund found himself caught between his genuine feelings for the woman before him and his deep-seated beliefs about honesty and social order. The attraction he felt had not diminished with the revelation of her true identity, but the knowledge that their entire relationship had been built upon deception created a barrier that seemed almost impossible to overcome. The royal dining room had become the stage for a drama more compelling than any theatrical production, with the assembled guests serving as both audience and chorus to events that would reshape their understanding of identity, character, and the true meaning of nobility. His Majesty, displaying the wisdom that had marked his reign, called for a brief recess to allow private consultations before any final judgment could be rendered about Margaret Fletcher's fate. During this interval, small groups formed throughout the dining room as guests discussed the extraordinary situation in hushed but animated conversations. The revelation had forced everyone present to examine their own assumptions about birth, breeding, and the sources of admirable character. Many found themselves questioning whether the rigid social hierarchies they had accepted without examination were truly justified by the evidence of their own experience. Lady Corvella discovered that her moment of triumph had transformed into something far more complicated than she had anticipated. While several guests congratulated her on her thorough investigation and praised her for protecting society from deception, others regarded her with a coolness that suggested disapproval of her methods if not her motives. The timing and manner of her revelation, delivered at such a public gathering with maximum dramatic impact, struck some as unnecessarily cruel regardless of its accuracy. More troubling to Lady Corvella was her growing recognition that her own motives had been more complex than simple devotion to truth and social order. Watching Lord Edmund's obvious distress as he struggled to reconcile his feelings with Margaret's deception forced Lady Corvella to acknowledge that jealousy had played a role in her determination to expose the impostor. This self-knowledge brought no satisfaction, only a growing awareness that her victory might prove hollow if it came at the cost of her own moral standing. Lord Edmund withdrew to a quiet alcove where he could observe Margaret without being part of the general discussion about her fate. What he saw intrigued him as much as it confused him. Despite being exposed before the most important gathering of London society, despite facing potential imprisonment or exile, Margaret maintained a dignity that seemed entirely natural rather than performed. Her responses to various guests who approached her during the recess revealed consistent kindness and genuine concern for how her deception might have affected others rather than self-pity about her own predicament. The Duke of Warrington, whose conversation earlier in the evening had focused on hunting hounds and medieval armor, surprised everyone by approaching Margaret with obvious sympathy. "My dear," he said in his gruff but kindly manner, "I've seen enough of life to know that circumstances sometimes force good people to make choices that others might judge harshly. Your conduct this evening shows more nobility than I've witnessed from many who were born to coronets." This endorsement from such an unexpected source seemed to encourage others to examine their own responses to the situation. The Countess of Pemberton, whose sharp tongue had destroyed many reputations over the years, found herself wondering whether society might actually benefit from the kind of determined self-improvement that Margaret had demonstrated. If noble character could be achieved through dedication and moral choice rather than merely inherited through bloodlines, what did that say about the foundations of their entire social system? Margaret herself used the recess to approach Lord Edmund, understanding that their conversation might be her last opportunity to address the man whose good opinion had come to matter more than the approval of all the rest of society combined. She moved toward him with the same grace that had characterized Lady Felora's deportment, but now that grace seemed more precious because it represented genuine achievement rather than inherited advantage. "Lord Edmund," she began, her voice quiet enough to ensure privacy despite the crowd surrounding them, "I cannot ask you to forgive deception of such magnitude, but I can tell you that my feelings for you tonight were the first entirely genuine emotions I have experienced since beginning this masquerade. Everything else may have been false, but what I felt when speaking with you was real." Lord Edmund studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize features that might soon be lost to him forever. "Margaret Fletcher," he said, again testing the unfamiliar name, "I find myself in the extraordinary position of discovering that the woman who attracted me this evening was not the noble heiress I believed her to be, but someone far more remarkable, a person who created herself through determination and intelligence rather than accepting the limitations of her birth." This observation represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of the situation. Rather than viewing Margaret's deception as proof of criminal character, he was beginning to see it as evidence of extraordinary capability and determination. The qualities that had attracted him to Lady Felora, intelligence, sensitivity, genuine warmth, belonged entirely to Margaret Fletcher. Only the external circumstances of title and inheritance had been false. When His Majesty called the gathering to order for final resolution of the matter, the atmosphere had shifted considerably from the initial shock of revelation. The room now contained a complex mixture of perspectives that reflected deep consideration of justice, forgiveness, and the nature of true nobility. His Majesty's judgment, when it came, displayed the wisdom and mercy that had characterized his reign. "Miss Fletcher," he said, his voice carrying throughout the dining room with royal authority, "your deception was serious and cannot be ignored. However, your conduct since assuming false identity has been exemplary by every standard of noble behavior. This presents us with an unusual opportunity to demonstrate that mercy can coexist with justice." The royal verdict was both punishment and redemption. Margaret would forfeit all claim to the Ashworth inheritance and title, but would be granted immunity from criminal prosecution in recognition of her exemplary conduct as Lady Felora. She would be required to make public acknowledgement of her deception and issue formal apologies to those she had deceived, but would be permitted to remain in London society under her true identity if any member of the nobility was willing to sponsor her continued presence. Lord Edmund stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Your Majesty," he said with the confidence of someone whose mind had achieved perfect clarity, "I would be honored to offer Miss Fletcher my protection and sponsorship. Furthermore, if she would accept my suit, I would ask permission to request her hand in marriage." The proposal sent another wave of shock through the gathering, though this shock was tempered by growing admiration for Lord Edmund's courage and Margaret's transformation. Several guests began to applaud, creating a sound that grew until it filled the entire dining room with appreciation for a love story that had transcended the boundaries of conventional social expectations. Margaret's response was delivered with tears streaming down her face but her voice clear and strong. "Lord Edmund, I accept your proposal with a heart full of gratitude for your understanding and love. I promise that as your wife, I will prove worthy of the faith you have shown in me tonight." Lady Corvella watched these developments with emotions too complex for easy analysis. Her exposure of Margaret's deception had been vindicated, but the ultimate result was a love story rather than the social destruction she had anticipated. As the evening concluded with toasts to the newly engaged couple and general acclaim for His Majesty's wise judgment, Lady Corvella began to understand that her victory had revealed truths more profound than simple fraud. The story of Lady Felora and Margaret Fletcher became legendary in London society, told and retold as an example of how love and character could triumph over the accidents of birth and the constraints of social convention. Lord Edmund and Margaret's marriage proved to be one of the happiest in their generation, blessed with children who inherited their mother's determination and their father's integrity. Lady Corvella, meanwhile, found that her role in exposing the deception had earned her a reputation for both brilliance and ruthlessness that made her simultaneously feared and respected throughout London society. She never married, dedicating herself instead to charitable works that helped other young women find legitimate paths to better lives. And in the end, the royal dinner of 1816 was remembered not as the night when Lady Felora was unmasked, but as the evening when English society discovered that true nobility resided in character rather than bloodlines, and that love had the power to transform even the most elaborate deception into the foundation for authentic happiness. The palace clock struck midnight as the last guests departed, marking the end of an evening that had changed lives and challenged assumptions in ways that would resonate through London's drawing rooms for generations to come. In exposing one truth, Lady Corvella had revealed many others, and in destroying Lady Felora, she had helped create Margaret Fletcher, Lady Blackwood, a woman whose nobility was earned rather than inherited, and whose love story proved that the most beautiful transformations were those of the human heart.